Let me just launch into things. The United Methodist Church is coming apart. Hundreds of churches in the United States have already left the denomination, as have several entire annual conferences overseas. And many hundreds more, I believe thousands more, in the United States are now entering the disaffiliation process or some other process to leave the United Methodist Church and to go to another denomination, in many cases to the newly formed Global Methodist Church. In saying that the United Methodist Church is coming apart, I take no pleasure. I have been serving in a leadership role for 37 years in the UMC and 34 as an ordained pastor. I have taught its history and doctrine at seminary. I have pastored churches, and it grieves me that we have come to the place we find ourselves today. But decades of numerical decline, compounded by increasingly bitter strife over doctrine and practice, has led us to this moment. And really, two different visions of the Christian faith have been pulling the denomination apart for decades. And now, we're seeing the start of a process of separating into two different denominations, the United Methodist Church and the Global Methodist Church. And so my goal tonight is threefold. First, I want to give you a little bit of background. How did we get to this place? What happened to bring us here? Secondly, tell me a little bit about the differences between the UMC and the GMC. And then finally, what does this mean for your local church? What are the options? What does this mean for your future? And that's what I want to try to cover tonight. And as a note, I am not unbiased or entirely objective. Newsflash, no one is. It is not possible to be entirely unbiased or objective. But it is possible, I think, and I will attempt to be fair and factual. Obviously, when I start projecting, moving forward, there's a bit more extrapolating from current trends, but I have documentation to back up everything that I say, which I can share with you if you like it later. Well, let's begin with background. How did we get here? For years, arguably since the denomination was founded, and can anybody tell me when the United Methodist Church began? This is a smart crowd, 1968. I thought someone would say, sometime in the 1700s with John Wesley, right? No, John Wesley began the Methodist movement, a revival that has issued forth in actually 75 or 80 denominations around the world that are now Methodist or Wesleyan of one kind or another. But the United Methodist Church as an institution, with its current constitution and structure and doctrinal standards, was founded in 1968. And there has been, I think, from that time, a struggle for the soul of the institution. And a widening gulf has yawned between people who embrace a classic or orthodox understanding of the faith, often called traditionalists, and those who are also styled progressives. Now, I know that those two terms can be problematic, and neither group would be monolithic. However, I think those terms can be seen as poles around which most folks cluster to one degree or another. So I'm going to stick with those terms going forward. Well, for the first few decades, progressives were clearly steering the ship of the denomination, but since the mid-1980s, the denomination has been moving slowly and steadily in a more traditional direction, at least as measured by the actions of the General Conference, which is the governing body of the denomination. And this was driven to a large degree by demographic changes, namely steep membership decline in the U.S., accompanied by extraordinary growth outside the U.S. And so if you look at some of these figures that I put up on the screen, you'll see that these most recent numbers, which go back to 2020 for the U.S. and 2019, I think, for outside the U.S., we are now a minority U.S. church. There are now less members of the UMC in the U.S. than there are outside the U.S. And this shift in demographics and in membership has led to a growing traditionalist majority at the General Conference every 4 years, because the non-USA delegates are overwhelmingly traditionalist. So this traditionalist or conservative majority has been especially evident in maintaining historic biblical standards on marriage and sexuality. And of course, these have been the kind of flashpoint issues of recent decades. By 2012, get some of that there. There we go. By 2012, it became clear to the progressive activists that they would not be able to change church teachings on marriage through debate and votes at General Conference. And so it was at that point that some decided to embark upon a campaign that they called civil disobedience. However, we're not a civil authority. We're not the government. That's really not the right term. The right term would be ecclesial defiance, because they were acting in defiance of the General Conference. Their goal was to force the church to change by violating church law, breaking their ordination vows, and using abusive rhetoric, accusing traditionalists of being hateful or even violent. And in our own Eastern Pennsylvania conference, you may remember that back in November of 2013, 36 United Methodist ministers participated in a very public act of defiance at Arch Street Church in Philadelphia, co-officiating at a same-sex ceremony. So by the time, there we go. By the time the General Conference convened in Portland, Oregon in 2016, the denomination was in crisis, and there was open talk of schism happening right then and there. I had the misfortune or fortune, depending on your perspective, of being a delegate there, so I was right in the middle of it. During the General Conference, the Council of Bishops, seeing what was happening, basically tried to call a timeout. They asked for authority from the delegates to seek a way to keep the United Methodist Church together despite the deep divide that was threatening to tear it apart. And this led to the formation of something you may recall called the Commission on a Way Forward. It was a team of 32 clergy and laity representing views all across the spectrum, traditionalist, moderate, progressive, etc. And the task of this Commission on the Way Forward was to help the bishops devise a plan, as I said, to keep the church together despite this deep divide. But that's not what happened. They didn't come up with a plan. They came up with 3 plans, and they couldn't choose between them. And the bishops did not officially endorse any of them, although they unofficially made it clear that many of them at least wanted the one church plan to pass, which would have essentially eliminated traditional language about marriage and basically created a local option for annual conferences and congregations. A special general conference was called in 2019 in St. Louis. Again, I had the fortune or misfortune to be a delegate there. And at that general conference, the goal of that conference was to pick a plan that would decisively set the course of the future of the global United Methodist Church. And that didn't happen because the plan that a lot of the leaders wanted didn't pass. The plan that did pass was the traditional plan. The traditional plan said we're going to stick with historic teachings on marriage and sexuality. It also added accountability features to the discipline for those who were acting in defiance of the discipline. And it also added an additional paragraph to the discipline to allow churches to disaffiliate or to leave the denomination if they were in disagreement with it. And actually, many of us thought that was being added at that point to allow progressive congregations to leave, because we thought they would be the ones who were upset by what happened. And the intent of the disaffiliation clause was to be as gracious as possible and let people go with their property. Many progressives, however, were unwilling to accept the outcome of this general conference, and they stepped up their campaign of resistance. On social and other media, a narrative took hold that the 2019 St. Louis conference had been marked by hateful and bigoted rhetoric against LGBTQ plus persons. I will tell you, I was there. That narrative is false. This just wasn't true. However, the narrative was effective, it took hold, and it resulted in a backlash that spring and summer as delegate elections across the U.S. for the upcoming 2020 General Conference were held, and a lot of traditional delegates were displaced by progressives. Still, because of the demographic shift, the progressives did not have a majority when you took the entire global church into account. So meanwhile, acts of defiance continued. This included public declarations by bishops, by conferences, even whole jurisdictions, that they would no longer comply with the rules and teachings of our book of discipline. Some progressive conferences and congregations actually began withdrawing financial support from African missions because of the way the African delegates had voted. And this really was something new, something unprecedented. Back from the time the Methodist Episcopal Church began and developed in the 1780s and 90s, it had always been understood that Methodists could argue, disagree about everything under the sun, but at the end of the day, when General Conference took a vote, we were all duty-bound to abide by that vote and what it embodied in the Book of Discipline. Now, however, there was a significant minority saying, no more, we're just not going to do that anymore. They were openly and publicly defying the church, doing what is right in their own eyes, to quote judges, and doing so without consequence. So the result has been that the divide has deepened. Trust in the institution and its leadership has reached new lows. Genuine accountability to the discipline has become virtually impossible. The denomination, many concluded, was becoming ungovernable and broken beyond repair. Congregations across the country, apparently reaching that same conclusion, began to use the disaffiliation clause added in 2019 to leave the UMC despite the high cost that was involved. While all this was kind of fermenting, we were supposed to have a general conference in 2020, and it looked like it was going to be another big collision. So a group of folks came together, led by Bishop John K. Yambasu, the late Bishop John Yambasu of Sierra Leone, to try to come up with a solution. This led to something called the Protocol of Reconciliation and Grace through Separation. An internationally known mediator named Kenneth Feinberg offered his services free of charge. He actually was in charge of the 9/11 Victims Fund and many other very prominent, this is a prominent fellow. And he helped to mediate an agreement between all the different groups within the UMC, from left to right, everywhere, and it resulted in the protocol. The protocol acknowledged that there were irreconcilable differences within the denomination, and it proposed a restructuring of the denomination into 2 or more denominations to succeed the UMC. Under its terms, annual conferences, local churches, and clergy could choose to align with one of those successor denominations without cost, and local churches would be able to retain their property and clergy retain their pensions. The protocol was then submitted to be debated and acted on at the upcoming May 2020 General Conference. And it seemed to have great momentum at that point. But then, of course, something happened in March of 2020, which upended all of our lives, and of course that was the COVID-19 pandemic, and it just shut the world down. And as a result, General Conference was postponed, first to the late summer of 2021, and then as the pandemic dragged on, again to the late summer of 2022. And meanwhile, various groups began to prepare for the post-protocol reality. People still thought the protocol was likely to pass. Members of the Wesleyan Covenant, by the way, here's the, not working. There we go. There's some summary statements about the protocol. I keep forgetting to use this thing. Sorry about that. So groups began to make plans for what would follow the protocol's passage as expected. Members of the Wesleyan Covenant Association, or WCA, of which I am a member of the governing council, began to develop plans for a post-separation traditional denomination. The WCA had actually formed in 2016, and its intent was to keep the United Methodist Church true to its doctrine and discipline. But as things began to fall apart, more and more WCA leadership began to conclude that, especially after St. Louis, that some kind of separation was now becoming inevitable. And so the group began working on draft sections of a proposed book of discipline for the new denomination. And in early 2020, a broader group of leaders, including some bishops, got together, and they created something called the Traditional Leadership Council, or Transitional Leadership Council, or TLC. And that took over leadership of developing this new denominational structure and discipline. In March of 2021, the TLC unveiled a framework for the new denomination, as well as a name. It would be called the Global Methodist Church. It released a website with a logo and a draft transitional book of doctrine and discipline that would govern the life of this denomination from the time it launched officially until it had a convening general conference. But it had not yet launched. It was still simply a plan. Well, meanwhile, other groups were also making plans, by the way. This is interesting. So in late 2020, a group called the Liberation Methodist Connection announced that they were also going to form a new denomination, a progressive denomination. They also wanted to leave. The protocol had provisions to allow for any number of denominations. I think you had to have 50 churches or more, and then you could form something. And so these folks said they were going to create a progressive denomination. In this denomination, there would be no fixed doctrine, but they would, they said, oppose colonialism, white supremacy, economic injustices, patriarchy, sexism, clericalism, ableism, ageism, transphobia, and heteronormativity, which is really hard to say 10 times fast. In December of 2021, which is interesting, just a few months back, about 8 months ago, the LMX said it was putting its plans to create this new denomination on hold because they were having a hard time finding common ground on what they agreed they were for. They had a lot easier time figuring out what they were against. They also cited having difficulty trusting one another, which is interesting. Well, amid this ferment, more local churches around the U.S. began to use the disaffiliation clause to leave the UMC. And so by the summer of 2021, a year or so ago, about 200 churches or so across the country had left. Not very many, but it included one from our own conference. You may remember that last year, Grandview United Methodist Church, just outside of the city of Lancaster, a progressive denomination, used the disaffiliation clause to leave. And 5 years before that, before there even was a disaffiliation clause, Wesley Church in Quarryville, down in southern Lancaster County, it also negotiated its exit from the denomination, and that's on the traditional or conservative side. Well, what began to happen is some progressive bishops, in an effort to try to save church properties and conference assets from leaving, once the protocol passed, they began to engage in appointments that appeared to be punitive. Local pastors, who are not ordained, do not have the same clergy rights as elders. Local pastors can simply be told they're not being reappointed. As an elder, I kind of have a union card. I mean, he's got to put me someplace, unless I get caught embezzling funds or something. But local pastors were particularly vulnerable because they could just simply be discontinued. In the case of elders, however, there were several high-profile cases that made national news in the spring of 2021 in North Georgia, California, and New Jersey, where it seemed that bishops were punishing people for just having conversations with their churches about possibly leaving. But most pastors and churches were keeping their heads down, it seemed, saying little, because they anticipated that later this month, General Conference would meet and it would make a decision. It would act on the protocol or several other plans. There would be a clarity, right? There'd be a plan of some kind that then people would have information to move forward. I was actually a member of the Commission on General Conference that plans General Conference. And when the General Commission decided to postpone General Conference for a third time, last March, I resigned in protest over what I thought was a politicized decision and not justified by the pandemic. I mean, right now things are happening. It was absolutely unnecessary. And I wrote a piece about that went viral nationally. Whether you agree with me or not that the third postponement was justified, it was a game changer. The protocol will certainly be submitted to the 2024 General Conference because it was postponed 2 more years, by the way, not just one. But it's much less likely to pass now, especially since just a few months ago, the progressive and centrist signers of the protocol, those who were part of the agreement negotiation, withdrew their support. So I think the protocol is much more in question now than it ever was before. So efforts to make this separation that's happening as amicable as possible is now starting to give way to more bitter and costly divisions, much like those experienced by other denominations in recent decades. On the same day that the postponement of the General Conference to 2024 was announced, the transitional leadership of the Global Methodist Church announced that it would formally launch the GMC as a functioning denomination on May 1st of this year, and that is what happened. A lot of the constituency that wanted to go to the GMC simply was not willing to wait, and many hundreds of additional churches seemed poised to pursue disaffiliation before the General Conference of 24 convened. And even though this year only less than 300 churches have, the disaffiliation process is complicated, it takes a while, and it has to have annual conference approval. And because General Conference was postponed in mid-March, it was too late for most churches to start that process in time for this May-June season of annual conference sessions for approval. And just as an example, to suggest that a lot more churches are now looking at it, in the Peninsula Delaware Conference, 5 churches were approved for disaffiliation at their June session this year. But by July 1, about 100 more had told the conference that they also want to disaffiliate. And those are just the ones that officially told the conference that. And I think we're seeing that all across the country. And you may have heard or read recently that now in a number of places, congregations are banding together as groups and employing attorneys and seeking to leave through legal action, and that includes our own conference, where nearly 30 churches have just recently, last week, announced that was what they're seeking to do. And that is happening or soon to happen in a number of different places around the country. So to sum up, The United Methodist Church, which has been divided and in conflict for years, is now coming apart. And I believe it is in the process of collapsing as a coherent institution. I think the United Methodist Church is in some real trouble. And I am still a United Methodist minister and plan to continue so, at least for now. I no plans to go anywhere else. And it really troubles me. Here's just some things that the UMC is facing in the years ahead. About 10 or 11 years ago, there was a study came out that announced the coming death tsunami. I don't know if you remember that term, but they were saying that basically our membership in the UMC in the United States was aging and dying off, and this would soon start to really reach very large levels of numbers. And I did some checking. In 2019 and 2020, we averaged over 200,000 members per year, each of those 2 years, gone. And that was attrition. That's just people leaving or dying and not being replaced because we've forgotten how to do evangelism. That is only attrition. It does not count losses from the split, because almost no churches had disaffiliated by the end of 2020. And that's when those figures came from. At that rate, the United Methodist Church, which was at 6.2 million at the end of 2020, will be down to 5.2 million in just 2 years. And that's just from attrition. Now, what might additional losses look like from those that actively seek to leave? Well, there was a study done in 2019, published by the United Methodist News Service, that said that 44% of American United Methodists describe themselves as theologically conservative. 28% is theologically progressive. If only half or so of that 44% left the church, with or without their property, that's upwards of another 1.5 million gone. So I really think the United Methodist Church is facing will be shrinking severely in the next few years. We know, as I said, that hundreds, perhaps thousands of congregations across the U.S. are now looking to disaffiliate or to leave in some other manner. And that does not include losses overseas, which could be an even higher percentage. And I think the biggest problem that the United Methodist Church faces going forward is this. How does the denomination reestablish institutional unity and accountability even after the conservative majority has left? Because there'll be plenty of things for those people left behind to argue about. But a precedent has been established that if a bishop, a conference, a jurisdiction does not like something in the discipline, they can simply refuse to abide by it. And there's no accountability. There's no redress. A determined minority can just dig in its heels. The toothpaste is out of the tube, as they say, and I don't know how it gets put back in. Well, let's move on to comparisons between the UMC and the GMC looking forward. And I've called this different trajectories. Now, I mentioned that there might have been more than 2 denominations coming out of the current UMC under the proposed protocol. At present, though, there are only 2 that seem certain and clearly defined regarding mission, doctrine, and structure. One, of course, is the United Methodist Church, which is now being called the Continuing United Methodist Church as this split unfolds. And, of course, the Global Methodist Church, or the GMC. And as I said, that launched formally this past May 1st as a functioning denomination. You can, by the way, there's a resource sheet that I gave Scott to pass out, and it has places you can go, including the website, UMC, GMC, WCA websites. On the website, you'll find the Transitional Book of Doctrines and Discipline for the GMC. So some points of comparison between the two. So there will be points of agreement. Both the GMC and the continuing UMC will continue to have a Methodist connectional structure. I think connectionalism is one of the defining things that makes Wesleyan Methodists who we are. Both will also retain bishops and conferences and general conference as a governing body. However, in the GMC, bishops will be term limited and be subject to far greater accountability than in the UMC. Bishops will also, in the GMC, have much more the role of articulators and defenders of the faith than I think they do now. Women will be included at all levels of leadership in both the UMC and the GMC, clergy, bishops, and everything else. And both denominations will continue to use various groups associated with the United Methodist Church, like Westpath, which is the pension board, UMCOR, which is our relief organization, Cokesbury, the publishing house. So a lot of those things will still be in common. What are some things that are different? Well, I think what's going to happen is that the UMC is likely to embrace more fully something that really has been in the culture for a long time, and that is theological pluralism. The idea that there can be many different theologies that pastors embrace and preach. The Articles of Religion and the Confession of Faith, which are our doctrinal standards, they will undoubtedly remain in the discipline, but really more as historical markers rather than really controls on what preachers are held accountable to. The GMC will hold clergy accountable to those classic definitions of the faith and will also include as doctrinal standards the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed. The United Methodist Church does not have those as doctrinal standards. We use them in worship, but they're not doctrines that we officially call standards. The United Methodist Church will almost certainly change the definition of marriage sometime in the near future. If not in 24, then I would think certainly by 2028. While the GMC will retain the historic understanding of marriage as between one man and one woman. In addition, the denominational structures will be different. In the GMC, there will be a much smaller denominational superstructure, requiring much less financial support by the local church. And last month, the TLC released a statement that they would hold local church apportionment givings. They're not calling it that; they're calling it connectional funds, to 2%. 1% for the global church and 1% for the local conference. That's what they're going to hold it to. Right now, in our conference, it's 9.5%. And in some conferences, it's over 10% in the UMC. Here are the mission statements of the GMC and the UMC. The United Methodist mission statement, you may know, is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And the GMC mission statement is to make disciples of Jesus Christ who worship passionately, love extravagantly, and witness boldly. But just as important as these points of comparison are, I think, is a larger issue of what I've called the differing trajectories of the two denominations. While sexuality and marriage have been, as I said, the flashpoint issues for conflict, I really think those have just been the presenting symptoms. I have a daughter who's a doctor I like to brag on. When you go to the doctor and you have a pain in your side, that's the presenting symptom. The doctor's job is to figure out what's the cause, what's really going on deep down. And I think that the conflict we've had over sexuality and marriage is a presenting system of something deeper. The deeper division, I think, is rooted in very different theological frameworks and worldviews. And I think it results in two different trajectories for these bodies. For traditionalists, for conservatives, it is Scripture which determines the content of the faith, especially as its core teachings have been understood by the great tradition of the church going back 2,000 years, as embodied in things like the creeds. But for progressives, human experience and reason, guided by modern scholarship, receive much more weight in determining what the church should proclaim. In an unusually frank discussion of what some progressives believe and do not believe, a United Methodist elder, ordained United Methodist pastor named Roger Woolsey, wrote this a couple of years ago. He said, "Friends, Jesus isn't God. Jesus didn't die for our sins. Jesus wasn't killed instead of us. God isn't wrathful or vindictive. There isn't a hell other than the ones we create here on this earth. Jesus' resurrection didn't have to be understood as a physical one to be a real and meaningful one. And Christianity isn't the only way for humans to experience salvation." Now, to be fair, not all progressives would agree with him on every point, or even most of those points. But here's the point. His views do illustrate acceptable preaching and teaching within the United Methodist Church even now. He is now an ordained United Methodist elder. And I think that sort of stuff will become more and more commonplace and acceptable in the UMC going forward. And we can even look to statements and actions by annual conferences, jurisdictions, and general agencies to get a sense of the culture that I think will completely take hold once many traditionalists leave. For example, another example, about a year or so ago, in June of 2021, the General Council on Finance and Administration, which is basically the denomination's finance committee, they announced that there would be a change in the way that local churches reported membership statistics. Instead of simply reporting male and female members, now there'll be a third option, non-binary members. Now, we could certainly have an interesting discussion whether that's a good idea. Maybe it is in our contemporary culture. Give people the option to report themselves as non-binary and to have a discussion about the theological implications of that as a denomination. After all, we are rooted in the scripture that says God created us male and female and so forth. So we could have a debate and discussion about that. But here's the point. None of that happened. The GCFA did not consult with theologians or bishops or conferences or members. They just simply changed it, which I think is an indication of the mindset of much of the leadership of the UMC, whose instinct, it seems, is simply to conform to contemporary culture. And I think you will see there's other examples that could be cited. So make no mistake, this division is not primarily about sexuality and marriage. That's just the presenting symptom of a deeper division between two increasingly different visions of the Christian faith. And our own Bishop Scholl, here of the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference, who is a progressive, has said as much in a letter that he sent out publicly on March 16th. And here's what he wrote. He said, quote, "Let me be clear. LGBTQ persons are not the reason for our differences. Our differences are because of our own beliefs, traditions, understandings, and attitudes." This split, I think, goes to the core kinds of issues like the authority of Scripture and of tradition, the meaning of sin and salvation, and institutionally, the integrity of discipline and doctrine in any organized church. The UMC increasingly tolerates or endorses this kind of a woke progressive gospel, while the GMC will defend and uphold historic Wesleyan orthodoxy as part of a global body, which will have, from the start, just about more folks overseas than in the U.S. I think an image that might be helpful with this is the Continental Divide. I don't know if any of you have been there. You may know that along the Rocky Mountains on the North American continent, there's a line, you might say, to the east of which all waters ultimately flow to the Atlantic, and to the west of which all waters ultimately flow to the Pacific. If you're out there, right at the divide, and you're near a couple of bodies of water on either side, they might not seem all that far apart. But there's a different dynamic at work within them. They're flowing in very different directions. And I think that is an apt image for the UMC and the GMC. With the majority of its membership and leadership likely to be inside the U.S., the UMC will still acknowledge Scripture, to be sure, but its reading of it will increasingly be influenced by the political, academic, and cultural norms of North American society. But with the majority of its membership and leadership increasingly outside the U.S., the GMC will likely align its policies and practices within the framework of global Orthodox Methodism. Last section, what does all this mean for my church, your church, the local church? Well, it means major changes are coming, which will impact all of us sooner or later. Make no mistake, again, the United Methodist Church is dividing, and your congregation has to make a choice at some point what you're going to do. But with General Conference now postponed 2 more years, things will now be more difficult for biblically faithful churches as this breakup unfolds. Because there's no now denomination-wide policy set by General Conference. And as a result, bishops and conferences are making up their own policies as to how to proceed. And so there's a tremendous variance from place to place. It depends very much what conference, what part of the country you're in, what the process is for churches that are seeking to discern whether to stay or to leave. Bishops are assuming powers of governance beyond their legitimate authority. They're supposed to simply implement the will and decisions of General Conference, and that's not necessarily happening. And in a number of areas, it is becoming clear that bishops and conference boards of trustees intend to impose crippling financial settlements for churches that seek to disaffiliate using that new paragraph 2553, that was added in 2019. So, what are your options? If, in fact, your congregation wishes to leave the UMC to align with the GMC or some other body, some churches are doing that. Some are going with the Wesleyan Church or even becoming independent. I don't think you can be independent and be Wesleyan. Connectionalism is part of who we are, but that's another discussion we can have. But one option is to seek to use the disaffiliation clause, paragraph 2553. And as you may know, our conference has recently been outlining what that process looks like, and you're supposed to make a decision by the beginning of next month if you want to be a part of that. But at a minimum, your church will have to be paid up on all of its apportionments, pay a year of apportionment in advance, and pay the present value of its share of the future unfunded liability for the pension fund, which is a significant number, although recent reports is that that's coming down, which is good news. But now we're finding that a number of conferences are adding additional costs, and that includes our own. And some places, we haven't even gotten a word on this either way in EPA, but some conferences are now adding a 50% value of your property, market value. They want 50% of the market value before they'll let you go. And if you look at the statement that was recently released by our own conference, there's a number of items, including a share in the $30 million Boy Scout settlement and other categories that are not even defined. They're not telling you what the numbers are. So it is likely to be prohibitively expensive. But that is an option, and some churches may have the funds and resources to do it. And by the way, the clock is ticking. Paragraph 2553 expires next year. That is why there's this pressure to get in the system now, because everything has to be negotiated and ready to be voted on by next spring. A second option, wait for the 2024 General Conference. Undoubtedly, there will be a number of plans proposed, including the protocol to the 2024 General Conference, to deal with what's happening. But it's very uncertain what will be the outcome of that. As I mentioned recently, the various signers to the protocol have withdrawn their support. So I think that it's much more in doubt as to whether that will pass. And any plan that is presented at the General Conference, once it's in the hands of the delegates, can be amended and changed in ways that we cannot anticipate. So we don't know what it's going to look like. So that's another option, though, and I think there are a number of churches who think that they're going to have to do that, and that's their plan. They're going to wait and see. Another option is take legal action now, and that is what I mentioned before is starting to happen across the country. It began in Florida. More than 100 churches in the Florida conference, about 20% of that conference, in May, notified their bishop that they were leaving and were not going to use 2553. Instead, they wanted to simply transfer under a different provision of the discipline. Dirty little secret is, before there ever was a 2553, churches have been able to leave the denomination. The trust clause, that legal instrument that basically gives ownership of the property to the conference, has been relaxed many times. Whenever a church leaves, closes, or what have you. Wesley Church in Quarryville negotiated its exit before there ever was a disaffiliation clause. So these churches in Florida say, we're not going to use 2553, we want to come out under a different, they wanted a more reasonable package to leave by. The bishop said no, and now that is entering litigation. And now that pattern is starting to get repeated in other places, and we're going to see where all of that goes. I think the key point here is that churches which do this are wise to do so in concert with other churches. One church negotiating with the conference is outgunned and at a disadvantage. But 50 or 100 working together is a different story. Option number 4 is do nothing. The default option is to simply do nothing, make no decision, and remain in the United Methodist Church. And this may be what some people feel, and some churches feel they are called to do, even if they are traditionalists. There are those pastors who feel it's their calling from God to be a kind of Orthodox witness within the United Methodist Church. Many people, however, believe that it's going to be harder and harder for those folks to survive and for local churches to be allowed to continue to remain historically Orthodox Wesleyan, because the bishop can, at some point, appoint whomever he or she wishes. But I think that could be an honorable decision that some churches seek to make, and that is certainly a possibility. There's even a 5th option. Leave the building behind. Especially if your building has a lot of debt, or is in disrepair, or is in a place that's difficult to sell, that might make sense for your church to do, because then all that becomes the conferences. We did learn something that we should have known during the pandemic. When we couldn't meet, my church didn't meet together for 6 months before we started coming back. And that is that, of course, the church isn't the building. The church is the people of God, assembled under the lordship of Christ, right? It's the people. And so some churches may well decide that the best option is to just simply turn over the keys and head down and start meeting at the local high school. But to consider any of these options, it's imperative to begin educating our congregations now on what's coming, beginning with your core leadership teams. Making no decision is a decision, right? So I think whatever course a church chooses to make, it should be intentional, it should be thought through, it should be prayerful. We are still waiting some key developments at the national level. That includes some judicial council decisions. I won't go into the details. We can maybe do that in the Q&A. And we're still seeing some of these policies at the annual conference level unfold, which is kind of unconscionable. 3.5 years after paragraph 2553 passed, and in some places, including our own, there's still not a lot of specificity onto what's involved. Some closing thoughts. First, do not be afraid. Fear not. 2 Timothy chapter 1 says this: God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Fear is a tool of the adversary of souls. It is designed to paralyze us, and keep us from doing God's will and experiencing God's blessing. Fear tends to magnify in our minds the potential pain that we're facing. You remember the story when Caleb and the other spies went into Canaan to scope out the promised land under Joshua, and they came back and they said, the land is inhabited by giants, and we were grasshoppers. Well, the people of God were not grasshoppers, but fear magnified the problem in their minds. So do not be afraid. Be calm and confident. If God is in this, and if, as Scripture said, as God is for us, who can be against? If God is in this process, it can't be stopped. One of my favorite texts is Acts chapter 5 in Gamaliel. Gamaliel was a member of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, which was the ruling council of the Jews at that time. And if you remember, the early church was preaching, and Pentecost had come, and the Sanhedrin called the apostles in and said, you got to stop preaching in the name of Jesus. And they threatened them with jail. They eventually beat them for it. But one of the Pharisees got up, a man named Gamaliel, a wise man. He said, stop, let them go. If this thing is of God, you can't stop it. You'll find yourself fighting God. But if it's not of God, it will fall under its own weight in time. And to me, that, I think, is wisdom to use. So if God is in this, it can't be stopped. Secondly, know your rights and your power under the discipline and as the people of God. If the progressives have shown us anything in recent years, it's that bishops and conference structures don't have the power over us that we like to think that they do. You know, the United Methodist Church does not have a police force or an army. Yes, it has the trust clause, which can be enforced by the government. That's a problem, which I find really odd, using the power of the state, the power of the sword, to compel people to stay in your church. But it is possible to resist abuses of power. Do not be intimidated by claims that you are acting in violation of the discipline or of your clergy covenant by simply educating your congregation, as we're doing tonight, or by making preparations for what is coming. And by the way, for those clergy here, you cannot be forced to declare what your intentions in the future might be. Okay? In some parts of the country, bishops and DSS are saying, I want you to tell me what you're going to do. You're going to stay, you're going to go. And we had a case here a few years ago, the Frank Schaeffer case. Remember that case? Part of the decision that allowed him to be reinstated said that the conference could not hold people accountable for possible future decisions. So you can cite that case as to saying, no, I'm in discernment. I don't know what I'm going to decide. A third piece is this: stay focused on your ministry. It is important to be informed. It's important to prepare. But don't let denominational madness become the central focus for you or your church. The best gift you can give any denomination is a vibrant, Christ-centered, and missionally focused congregation. And finally, get connected. The genius of Methodism from the beginning has been its connectional system. The connection makes us more effective in mission. It creates relationships with colleagues and friends who keep us accountable and who encourage us. Many people, many churches feel that they are isolated and alone. They suffer from what I call the Elijah syndrome. You may recall that when the prophet Elijah was fleeing from the wrath of Queen Jezebel, he went up to the mountain and he said to God, I'm the only one left. And what did God say? No, you're not. I have thousands in the land who have not yet worshiped the local God. God told him there were many people still with whom he could make common cause and find encouragement. Same is true today. So one such place is the WCA. The Wesleyan Covenant Association has chosen to remain within the United Methodist Church at this time in order to help churches discern what their future will be. And if you check our website or the national website, there are lots of resources, lots of information that you can find there. And we also have a local chapter which has begun meeting every other Thursday morning at 10 via Zoom. And we have some in-person gatherings. We already had one a month or two ago that are going to be happening in our conference. So you can go onto our webpage. You can register to get the emails that will be coming out each week, and also find out other ways to get connected. I'm just close by saying just be in prayer. For all of us, I think the next few years are going to be very difficult as we navigate all these very choppy waters. But remember, God is sovereign. Nothing takes God by surprise. God has already prepared a path forward for you, for your congregation. Trust Him, but don't neglect to do your part in seeking His will and in making informed and faithful choices.